Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. I'm your host, Mark Mansour. You hear it every time there's a new Trump outrage. Relax, the system will hold, we've got checks and balances. We heard it the first time he was elected. We heard it when he tried to extort Ukraine. We heard it after January 6th. And we're hearing it again now with Donald Trump, this time older, angrier, and surrounded by people who spent 4 years in the political wilderness drafting a blueprint for how to bend American institutions to his will. This isn't speculative anymore. It's just the first years of Trump 2.0. He has moved to strip civil service protections from tens of thousands of federal workers through a revised Schedule F style classification, now branded as a policy/career category, turning career experts into at-will employees whose jobs depend on political loyalty. At the same time, the Justice Department has been pushed away from the post-Watergate norm of independence toward open loyalty to the president's personal and political interests, with his investigations and priorities increasingly aligned with Trump's grievances and targets. The comforting story we tell ourselves is that America is different. Our courts are independent. Our elections are free. Our agencies are nonpartisan. No one president can just flip the off switch on democracy. But that's not how democracies usually die. They die slowly. They die behind a facade of legality. They die while a lot of people are telling themselves that nothing fundamental has really changed. So in this episode, The Breaking Point, American Democracy in the Trump 2.0 Era, I want to walk through how this second term is accelerating democratic erosion, not as a cable news panic, but as a sober, historically grounded look at what's happening. Capturing the referees, tilting the playing field, rewriting the rules, and criminalizing opposition. And then I want to talk about where the pressure points still are, because fatalism is one of the most useful tools an authoritarian project has. The obvious question is, if Trump already tested the system once, what's actually different this time? There are three key differences: preparation, weaker guardrails, and open intent. First, preparation. Trump's first term was chaotic and impulsive, and a lot of the most extreme ideas ran into resistance, sometimes from courts, sometimes from civil servants, sometimes from Trump's own appointees who still cared about basic democratic norms. When his team floated Schedule F in 2020 to reclassify large swaths of the civil service, it barely got off the ground before Biden revoked it. This time, the administration spent the intervening years turning that idea into a concrete plan. In early 2026, the federal personnel bureaucracy moved to finalize rules implementing a revived version, now described as a policy career track, with estimates that tens of thousands of federal workers could lose key protections and effectively become at-will employees. These are not random clerks. They are the people who translate law into reality inside agencies. The purpose is simple. If you can fire career experts at will, you can replace them with loyalists and intimidate the ones who stay. One detailed analysis of Trump's Schedule F strategy made the point that you don't need to fire everyone. You just need to fire enough people to send a message about who is really in charge. Second, weaker guardrails. In Trump's first term, a non-trivial number of Republicans and officials, state secretaries of state, local administrators, even some judges he appointed, refused to help overturn the 2020 election or slow walk certifications. Many of them paid for it with their careers, their safety, or both. By the time Trump re-entered office, his party had largely purged or sidelined many of those dissenters, replacing them with candidates openly committed to his narrative about elections and lawfare. Surveys show that under Trump's return, partisan gaps in how Americans rate the quality of U.S. democracy are at record levels. Republicans more satisfied under his leadership, Democrats seeing a deep decline, and overall ratings stuck at diminished levels. Third, open intent. In his first term, Trump often wrapped his authoritarian impulses in the languages of law and order or draining the swamp. Now the project is more explicit. He has spoken openly about using the Justice Department to go after his enemies and undo what he calls the weaponization of government by weaponizing in the opposite direction. Reporting has documented internal weaponization tasking inside DOJ, pressure on prosecutors to prioritize investigations of Trump critics, and direct presidential orders or demands to investigate specific adversaries, from state attorneys general to former federal officials and Democratic politicians. This has already begun, and many of them have failed. But at the bottom line is, he's going to continue doing it. So this is not the same man in the same environment, repeating the same improvisations. This is Trump with a plan, a more captured party, and fewer people inside the system willing or able to say no. Political scientists who study Democratic backsliding have seen this movie before in places like Hungary, Turkey, India, and Poland. The pattern is depressingly familiar. Capture the referees, tilt the playing field, rewrite the rules, criminalize opposition, and normalize it all through propaganda. Start with the referees, the institutions that are supposed to be neutral: courts, prosecutors, election officials, auditors, and civil servants. In Trump 2.0, the Justice Department is a central example of referee capture. Norms dating back to Watergate held that DOJ should maintain substantial independence from day-to-day political demands from the White House. Those norms are now openly flouted. Trump has used interim and acting appointments to bypass Senate confirmation, installed loyalists in key prosecutorial posts, and pressured them to prioritize cases that serve as political interests and personal grievances. At the same time, the attack on the civil service, to revive Schedule F-style policies, targets the bureaucratic backbone of the state. By stripping civil service protections from policy influencing positions and pushing through a new policy career classification, the administration makes it far easier to fire people who refuse legally dubious orders or who insist on accurate data and honest analysis. Federal worker organizations and good government groups warn that this will politicize agencies, erode nonpartisan expertise, and make it harder to resist unlawful or unethical directives. Once the referees are captured or cowed, you tilt the playing field. A tilted playing field doesn't abolish elections. It rigs their conditions. Over the last decade, the U.S. has already seen aggressive gerrymandering and the erosion of voting rights in many states, both of which scholars identify as central drivers of Democratic backsliding. Under Trump's renewed leadership, those trends intensify. The Justice Department shows little interest in enforcing voting rights protections. State-level policies framed as election integrity make it harder for disfavored constituencies to vote, and partisan actors seek greater control over election administration and certification processes. You then rewrite the rules. You don't need to amend the Constitution to concentrate power in the presidency. You can do it with executive orders, emergency declarations, creative legal theories about the unitary executive, and the quiet hollowing out of statutory checks through regulatory reinterpretation. Analysts note that Trump's second term has been marked by a rapid concentration of authority in the executive branch, with more decisions driven into opaque administrative channels and fewer opportunities for public or congressional input. If you control who interprets and enforces the rules, you effectively rewrite them without touching the text. Criminalizing opposition is the next step. The second Trump administration has used DOJ to open highly publicized investigations into political opponents, state and local officials, and liberal civil society organizations, often with thin legal bases but loud rhetoric. Trump's own public remarks and documented pressure on the Attorney General show a fixation on retribution, demanding probes and prosecutions of adversaries, ranging from state prosecutors who pursued his businesses to former law enforcement officials involved in earlier inquiries, as well as Democratic politicians and infrastructure like the fundraising platform ActBlue. Even when cases don't result in convictions, the goal is clear: to raise the cost of opposition and send the message that crossing this president can trigger the full machinery of the state. Finally, all of this is normalized through propaganda. Trump portrays himself and his supporters as victims of weaponized government, even as he repurposes the state to attack critics. Right-wing media ecosystems amplify this narrative, while a large part of the public, exhausted, polarized, or disengaged, tunes out. Scholars tracking public perceptions of democracy find that Americans' ratings of democracy's quality have declined and remained low, with sharp partisan divergences under Trump's renewed presidency. That environment makes collective defense of democratic norms far harder. So what does all of this feel like on the ground for actual people? Imagine you're a state-level election official who stood up to Trump's attempts to overturn the 2024 election. You certified results, followed state law, and may have even testified about pressure you faced. Now, 2 years into Trump's second term, the Justice Department announces a prominent investigation into irregularities in your state's past elections. Anonymous leaks insinuate that you may have engaged in misconduct enough to splash your name across headlines and to mobilize Trump's base against you. Even if the case ultimately fizzles, the process is punishing: legal bills, harassment, security concerns, political isolation. The next official watching this thinks twice before resisting pressure in a close race. Or imagine you're a career analyst at EPA, CDC, FDA, or USDA. Under both parties, you saw your job as providing accurate information and honest advice. Now your role has been reclassified under the new policy career category modeled on Schedule F. Overnight, you're effectively at will. Job protections and appeal rights are weakened. Unions warn that this is a direct attack on the merited civil service. It is. You notice the colleagues who raise legal or scientific concerns about favored policies are quietly reassigned or find themselves under investigation. You hear the political appointees now exert more control over hiring and promotion, with ideological alignment effectively screened in. Official statements frame these changes as about efficiency and accountability, but everyone understands the real message. Fall in line or start looking for another job. Or put yourself in the shoes of someone working at a civil society organization, a legal nonprofit, a university center, a democracy reform group that has challenged some of Trump's policies or defended those he has targeted. The administration and its allies cast such groups as partisan lawfare operations. Suddenly, you're facing an onslaught of audits, investigations, and regulatory scrutiny. You're not banned. Your office doors are still open, but grant reviews drag on. Tax exemption questions are raised. Federal partnerships quietly disappear, and corporate donors back away rather than risk association with a group the president rails against. At the same time, analyses point out that democratic erosion has real economic costs, undermining predictable governance, reliable data, education quality, tourism, and independent media, all of which businesses depend on. But many leaders are reluctant to say this publicly while contracts and regulatory decisions hang in the balance. None of these stories requires tanks in the streets or a suspended constitution. They're about raising the cost of resistance and lowering the cost of abuse, step by step. So where are the counterforces? Courts remain a partial check. Many judges, including some appointed by Republicans, still care about precedent and institutional legitimacy and have pushed back on overreach in key cases. But they cannot enforce their own rulings. They rely on compliance from the executive branch, state officials, and the broader legal system. Civil society groups and state governments have used litigation strategically to slow or block some of Trump's more aggressive moves. But the effectiveness of that strategy depends on time, public attention, and institutional cooperation. States and localities are another critical arena. In the past, state governments have both contributed to and resisted democratic backsliding through gerrymandering and restrictive voting laws on the one hand and through protections for voting access and civil liberties on the other. In the Trump 2.0 era, states that choose to act as democracy sanctuaries can still expand access to the ballot, protect protest rights, and refuse to cooperate with certain forms of federal overreach, even as others align more closely with the regime's project. Civil society and independent media remain essential. Analyses from democracy research organizations emphasize that Trump's second term is not just about state institutions. It's all about weakening societal checks by attacking independent media, punishing critical law firms, and constraining civic organizations. The flip side is that supporting those institutions financially, politically, and culturally is one of the last lines of defense against a hollowed-out democracy. That includes local newsrooms, public interest law groups, unions representing federal workers, voting rights organizations, and watchdogs that track administrative changes like Schedule F 2.0. Then there is public opinion and participation. Surveys show that Americans' overall rating of U.S. democracy have fallen and remains at historically low levels, but there is still broad rhetorical support for democratic principles across the spectrum. The challenge is translating that abstract support into the concrete action at the points where it matters: state legislative races, Secretary of State and Attorney General offices, school boards, professional associations, and corporate governance. So where does that leave us in the Trump 2.0 era? First, we have to give up the fantasy of a single dramatic red line. There is no one moment when a loudspeaker blares democracy is now over. Instead, there is a series of administrative changes, legal maneuvers, personnel decisions, and targeted punishments that, taken together, move a system from flawed democracy to diminished democracy. Second, we need to focus on power, not vibes. The problem isn't just the president's rhetoric. It's specific levers being pulled. The restructuring of the civil service through Schedule F-style rules, the politicization of DOJ, the manipulation of election administration and certification processes, the targeting of critical civil society organizations and independent media. For each of these, there are specific decision makers, regulators, legislators, justice, judges, executives, who can be pressured, supported, or replaced. Third, we have to protect communities of shared reality. When the president and his allies insist that any constraint on their power is lawfare, that any unfavorable election is rigged, that any critical reporting is fake, they are not just defending themselves, they're trying to destroy the conditions under which democratic argument is even possible. Supporting independent journalism, especially at the local level, is not charity, it's infrastructure. The same goes for organizations that defend voting rights, civil liberties, and government transparency. And finally, we have to decide what we're willing to do with the knowledge that we are living at a breaking point. Future historians will not write about this period as just another partisan pendulum swing. They will write about it as a hinge, the era when the United States either slid into a permanently diminished democracy or pulled itself back from the edge. Institutions alone won't save us. They are being bent and repurposed in real time. But that also means our choices, where we direct our attention, our money, our labor, our votes, still matter. This episode resonates with you. Don't just nod along. Share it with someone who still thinks this is just politics as usual. Support a local newsroom. Join or back an organization that defends civil service protections or voting rights. Pay attention not only to what Trump says, but to what his regime quietly does with the machinery of the state. This has been America's Fractured Politics. I hope you'll join me again for our next episode.